Welcome to Nameless Debate Radio, where radioactivity is contagious. You can join us in broadening our minds on the Nameless Debates Discord via the link below and even feature here yourself, if you've got what it
Just
takes.
waiting for things to populate. Oh, I think that's a recording bot, or is that a user? Oh wait, no, that's a recording bot. Is where's Drift Switch, your beloved counterpart? All right, we chilling.
What's cracking, ladies and gentlemen?
Yo. No, I see Drift Switch right now. I just saw him. Oh, yo, NSYNC. I don't know why, but I can't react to things in Coliseum chat.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have a look at it after, I guess.
You're right.
So, actually, the event notification or whatever is a bit misleading. Obviously, here's Phil. That's in the event notification. But so Flappy, who I was originally going to do the debate with, flew away. So Phil has graciously agreed to fill in. No pun intended. Which was good. Good for me because I thought it meant I could keep the topic and my position, which is a position that I actually genuinely hold. So I thought that was pretty cool. But then Phil said he didn't think he could do a good job with the negative side of the argument yesterday, like late last night. So we switched. So I've only had a little chunk of today to do any kind of preparation. I don't know how much Phil's done. But so I'll be arguing against the view that psychology can be considered science, and Phil will be arguing for it, as opposed to what we had originally planned.
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry about that. I was just thinking like, oh, we want to make this a good event. I think was like the part of the conversation too. Like I knew that I was just gonna peter out real quick. It's indeed it's also something that I think is something I could more readily argue because it's a position I hold as well. But I do think that we'll be able to, just for the audience, like where there is going to be different areas of what can be considered science or what could be considered psychology that might make the debate more intricate. There might be a position that, let's say even from a judge's perspective, that we might have to narrow our definition of psychology. So I think we're going to be in for a good time on both sides.
Yeah, and so Phil and I have discussed the format. So we're going to do 5-minute opening statements, and then 40 minutes of just free conversation, and then 5-minute closing statements each. But there's probably no need to do timing on the opening and closing. Just do timing on the whole hour and let us know when we're at like 50 minutes or whatever, so we can do the closing.
Yep. Yeah, very generous switch drift. Yeah, by the way, I hope if I did not make that clear, NSYNC was very generous in letting me switch positions. Thank you.
So,
yep.
David, do you want to, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm a timekeeper. I mean, if you guys have like a stopwatch or something.
Surely you can just use an internet one or something, dude. Like it's harder for us to keep track of it. Because we're obviously focused.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't want to have to do like a bunch of like formal explanation. So I'll just like say like when your opening starts. Let me look for a timer.
Yeah, you won't. Really, what we're looking for is just to let us know when we've got to start making closing statements and when we've got to start wrapping it up.
All right. So do you want me to start a timer for the opening?
Yeah.
No, well, that's the thing is, it doesn't. I mean, I've already timed mine. I know mine's 5 minutes. His will probably be about the same. So there's no need. But you can if you like.
Jack also said that he could time keep.
All right, that makes sense.
I'm happy to let him go a little over if he did happen to go. Yeah. So because we're going to be going into open conversation, it's not a big deal if the opening goes a little over. We just want to be timing the ending so we can get finished on time, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So do I remember that the affirmative makes their opening statement first, or I don't remember.
Probably.
Okay. Yeah. So Yeah, welcome everybody. So Nameless, you're gonna time keep then, is that good? I saw Jack said he could.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, both of you can. I don't know. It doesn't, as long as
All
someone tells it. But so obviously the topic, guys, is psychology a real science? I will be arguing that it's not. Phil will be arguing that it is.
Okay. So yeah, to start off, I thought what would be prudent is to start expanding what all could be psychology or science to make my position. Initially, upon just cursory research on this topic, psychology isn't my mainstay, but it is something I'm familiar with. I thought it would be prudent to start off with if it is a science before we actually determine what all is the nature of psychology, because that does seem to me, at least I will set out here, is the first thing that does need to be established. Is it a science? I guess it is, as the affirmative needs to be. You need to be meeting certain criterion, which I think we could set out here. I got where's my definitions here? Excuse me. So we have which one? Which page am I on? The criterion that needs to be met. You have to have like definitions to start off, which there are definitions that have been brought into further as the science has developed, and even just taking the definition of psychology as it was starting to be made as a field around the time of Freud, we could say that it started to have definitions that have now been put into concrete ways. You can make certain analogous claims about even just the general definitions that developed despite changes from, say, the Myers-Briggs type indicator to talk about personality tests with regard to psychology to the Big Five, that there's going to be things that have stuck across that time. So that's just definitions alone. We also are going to have the fact that it's already following the methodology of science, that it is following rigorous hypotheses and going through proper experimental methods and following certain parameters. Then you're going to have, in addition to that scientific rigorousness, that there is a level to which that things like ethics, ethics committees and the like, are going to be, sorry, I'm seeing the deck, I'll gotta close the text chat, are going to be maintaining the ethicality of the thing. But that even at the start of understanding psychology as it current stands in the literature, that it is following rigorous scientific methodology. But even to look at expansive definitions of what psychology could and couldn't be, not only is it that it is present within modern day culture, but it is practiced with at least a marginal amount of scientific rigorousness within these disparate fields of what could be called psychology. Far as that would go, I think that would be the best. Goodness gracious, seeing text chat is so goodness. But yeah, all in all, I think that it is a science based on those things that that there is going to be a level to which, goodness gracious, how do I can't even all right, yeah, for real, yeah, okay. But that to start off, it's already following a sort of scientific method that's being treated as science insofar as what science is with these like things like definitions and following a rigorous scientific method such as having a hypothesis and having certain parameters that are met. But then even at that, if you were to expand what is or isn't psychology, you could find that it's still very much prevalent today in practice, at least scientifically, if not also, yes, scientifically. Bro, I don't even know how to block this text chat for real. Oh, wait. Notification settings. There we go. Sweet, now I can just like not see that. That's great. Ooh, just somebody let me know. If a judge or if somebody wants to come in and let me know if there's something pertinent I should be looking at. This still shows up.
No, I think it's Instinct's turn. If you're done with your opening statement.
No. I mean, is he done?
Yeah.
I think he is.
Okay. The question we're here today to decide is whether psychology can rightly be described as a science, or if there might be a rather more apt term to describe what is actually occurring within psychological practice. I will be critiquing the view that psychology is science, but it is important to realize that I'm not thereby devaluing the contributions psychology makes to the human condition. Rather, I will simply be articulating significant methodological differences which warrant the distinction between doctoring the soul and science as such. Some of these differences are easily conceived, such as the emphasis in science on the elimination of subjective biases, which is utterly impossible within psychological practice, as well as the requirement that scientific notions ought to be falsifiable through experimentation. Most of the constructs in psychology are not really testable per se, because there is no way to isolate the variable which is supposedly being described by a certain psychological construct and demonstrate that it is reliably and measurably there. Science is a kind of puzzle-solving enterprise, which involves formal descriptions of processes and entities active in the world, and it concerns the extrapolation from these models to predictions, which are not only falsifiable, but have some degree of accuracy in terms of defining future developments or situations. Although the term science derives from the Latin scientia, which just means to know, in the modern day, science has a much richer context, a background of ideas and assumptions which form the scientific method. This is the philosophy of science, and it should not be surprising to hear me say that in modernity this is primarily an empirical enterprise, focused around the controlled collection of observational data and statistical analysis of that data. Yet, although psychological research which has this character is regularly performed, the results are largely inconclusive with respect to the legitimacy of the various frameworks for thinking about psychological phenomena, or the various entities and axioms which they postulate as being true. What's more, psychology generates no testable predictions, and this, perhaps above all else, is reason enough to doubt that it can be considered scientific. To take another angle, healing is arguably more art than science, although medicine does indeed involve a lot of scientific knowledge. Yet the actual process of healing involves the practical application of techniques to produce the non-theoretical result of wellness in the patient. And what is perhaps more important is that it involves caring for the patient, for which there can never be a formula. Psychological healing is even closer to art because there is so little scientific support underwriting our investigations at this point. Hence, I think, if anything, psychology as we currently understand it is better described as pre-scientific, as alchemy was to chemistry. There are certain elements within psychology today which, in the future, will probably blossom into a science as we expand our capacity to model the neurological structure of cognition and emotion. For now, though, we are left with just so much speculation, and there is little we can currently do to clear the fog. Therefore, I cannot see how it is justifiable to describe psychology as it currently stands, or in its historical development, as a science. Hello, that was the end.
All right.
I figured you would get that from the silence.
Yeah. I was wondering if there was going to be an announcement of it, but I'd pick up. Okay, so do we have any sort of formality to how this discussion starts, or is it just do we respond in kind?
I think initially it's best if there's anything in what I said that you'd like to respond to, you can do that now, and I'll do the same, and then
sure.
We can just get into it.
All right. Could you recapitulate what you all mean and not mean by pre-scientific, please?
Yeah. So it's like a kind of investigation of reality that does involve some experimentation, but the experimentation presupposes the ideas essentially. There's no attempt to falsify. There's no idea of like the theorists come up with ideas and use the ideas uncritically, essentially, to explain the phenomena. And there's no way to differentiate between the models. Like, none of them are better or worse. All of them are wrong, basically. It seems. I mean, there's no, something like that.
Right. So are at this point, are you doubting the scientific rigor of science as such, like say as science is defined, say in our modern day world? Then
No.
Maybe
So like
I'm making a jump. Could you
as I
explain
said, like pre-scientific as in like alchemy is to chemistry, right? Chemistry is scientific alchemy, basically.
Right. So, but then that's what I'm wondering. It's like, okay, we are in a sense applying scientific methodology within the fields of psychology, especially in contrast to those of the like of like Jungian and Freudian psychology.
Well, you said this, but like, what rigorous scientific methodology does psychology actually employ?
So I only mentioned it scantily, mainly because I didn't have the exact 5 basic criterion that I was referring to. So the first one I'd already mentioned that there are more or less, I will grant, but beyond that granting, I think it's just a mere point of politeness, I would even say, that there are clearly defined terms that have been developed, like say within the DSM-5 as it stands right now, that have developed over time. Pre-scientific, sure, but I don't think that it would go so far to like in the sense like, okay, I could see where you're drawing the line between alchemy and chemistry, but as it stands, it's a science in today's modern world. It has clearly defined terms, in a sense that we reach, and here are the other requirements that I would like to bring to the floor. So there's also a quantifiability that I'm seeing here. Highly controlled experimental conditions. So this is my mentioning of the scientific method as it was. You're following a hypothesis. These sort of needs for, like, say, a control variable, an experimental variable, or something like that. And you say that the results are inconclusive, and yet we're able to still participate in what's called here reproducibility, what I'm referring to. And then and it goes on here. At least I'm borrowing from an article that I was looking to prep for this.
I mean, interesting that you should bring up reproducibility, I think, because in your preamble, when you sort of attempted to outline a definition of psychology, rather, I thought it was interesting that pretty much everything you mentioned was a personality construct, right? So like the typologies, right? Different typologies, and then you mentioned the big 5. Interestingly, apart from the big 5, none of those are empirically reliable. They don't cash out in any kind of rigorous, like, we know that there's good evidence that MBTI and some of the other socionics and stuff like this. And in fact, there's a really great sort of linguistically inspired methodology for the Big 5, which makes it perhaps the best model of personality psychology that we could get, which is essentially like they measured the actual occurrence of a variety of different words, adjectives and stuff that sort of describe personality, and they sort of measured cross-culturally basically how often these are used. And so the most common ones were essentially identified as like dimensions of personality, that's a relatively intelligent approach, right? But that's so personality psychology is just one aspect of psychology, and I would argue that the brunt of psychology is focused on therapy, healing, right? And the theories that are proposed in psychology, apart from, let's say, in the subfield of personality science, are frequently employed in therapeutic environments that are not scientific at all. Right? And it's not like the model has to wait to be peer reviewed, right? Like, there are certain schools of thought, none of which has real empirical validity at all, because how do you test for, like, sort of psychological constructs, some of which are even unconscious, right? There's various models, and it would seem that what determines which ones are employed in practice, in clinical settings, right? That's what psychology is, like I said before, it's a healing thing. You're trying to help people who are mentally ill. And so the ideas you apply, these aren't scientifically verified ideas. There's nothing scientific about it.
Okay. Well, but so I'm gonna backtrack a little bit to try to follow your whole line of thought there. So you started off with pointing out my use in my preamble about personality psychology as my starting ground. You were talking about how the personality type test, the MBTI, was seen to not be as producible as, say, excuse me.
No, not as reproducible, unreliable.
So not you weren't commenting on my mention of reproducibility when you made that remark?
I was commenting on the idea of a rigorous scientific methodology, because according to, like, let's say a rigorous methodology, a number of the constructs that you named, which by the way is just, that comprises just a subfield of psychology, but a number of the constructs you named are actually suffer from exactly the problem I'm saying is a kind of a paradigm problem for psychology, which is like they just weren't really, you couldn't find any real evidence of them, basically. There seemed no way to get it. And the tests that we did do basically came up to disconfirm the hypothesis. And now there's obviously people who still believe in it and still incorporate that into how they interact with other people, right?
So so what you're saying though is that they found that the conclusions that they came to were false. That there's this continued trend of inconclusivity.
Not just inconclusivity, but straight up inconsistencies with what the theory would be predicting, basically.
Right. So to continue on with trying to respond to your main response to my entrance into the main discussion, you started to expound upon how the Big Five goes about a linguistic method. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And that in comparison to what we were using as that example that you mentioned, the MBTI, talking about not just this inconclusivity, but this unreliability, that you said that in comparison, the Big Five has exceeded that expectation and actually has met it. Is that correct?
Yes, but there's no comparable model for other domains within psychology. Like personality science has hit upon a gem there, basically. Okay. But it's hard to see how you could reproduce that.
So let's go ahead and let's cross our T's and dot our I's. Let's go to a different subfield of psychology. Could you choose one that you think meets this?
Yeah, we can just talk about like what I basically emphasized as the main thing, which is like therapy, right? Therapy for mental disorders, right?
Okay, so you're talking about mental disorders. I had mentioned the DSM-5, but what are we going to talk about then? Are we talking about say treatments of like things in the dark triad, like psychopathy and narcissism, or are we even just speaking about being a career psychologist for that matter, insofar as you're talking about being therapeutic?
Neither of those.
Please.
So, what was the question you asked me? To which the answer I gave was psychological disorders and stuff.
Right. So you were talking about personality psychology being this sort of gem that was hit upon, and I wanted to just simply jump to a different field.
Well, no, not personality psychology being the gem, the Big Five model. Right.
And that's within personality psychology
So talk about like a diagnostic approach, right? The issue is that in medicine, it only takes one case essentially for there to be something new, basically. Like, so it's like the reproducibility aspect, first of all, like straight up falls away, right? You have someone who presents with an unknown illness. You come up with a new illness, essentially. That's kind of how it works. And then it helps if other people are found to have it. But like a lot of the time, especially in the past, you couldn't really, communicate. There's no, way to check whether it's just like, you're like, okay, this is something I've never seen before, but I'm going to, instead of trying to fit it into one of my boxes I've already got, I'll come up with a new box, right? Which is quite opposed, really, to, let's say, how science goes about it, where we're looking for reliability, right? Where we're looking for reproducibility. We're looking for lots of cases, or at least a statistically significant number of cases, right? 1, 2, 3, 5. That's not enough.
Okay. Do you rest your response there?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So on that basis, then I could see that psychology is a science based on the fact that as long as you are continuing that process, which even if you want to call it pre-science, it's still in initiating itself into the scientific practice. Psychology is by continuing to at least make sure that it's falsifiably accurate by ascertaining, okay, if we do find an outlier, let's make sure that we go through the scientific method again.
What? No, I don't understand that. Like, what I'm trying to explain is that going through the scientific method doesn't necessarily eject the legitimacy of a case study or a specific of a specimen, right?
Right.
Like, for example, for like, and like, this is not characteristic of science. There are a couple of sciences which have this irregularity, right? But it's one way in which it's sort of deviates from the typical character which we would expect to see in science, is that usually in science we're looking for reproducibility before we will like make a conceptual category to contain the examples, right?
Okay. All right. I think I see where I messed up here because I agree with that. What I'm seeing though is that once you have a case that hasn't been made a case study, it still is able to be initiated into scientific practice. So just as we might find that there's this scientific discovery, if you will, quote unquote scientific discovery of some sort of outlier in, say, chemistry, especially how nowadays, and this is where I might take some issue with your talking about alchemy versus chemistry here, being pre-science, so to say, is that you have this sort of discovery that might be found upon that has a psychological character that, as far as psychology can be instantiated as a science since, like I said, around the 1960s with Freudian psychology, I would say that it's been a science ever since then because it does follow a scientific method since then.
What's the scientific method that it supposedly follows, though?
Yeah, so we talk about with the DSM-5 how it has this sort of rigorous way of even adding its terms, but if you want to zoom out to understand how the scientific method goes about, I think it does. It follows having ethics board. Say it follows having measurable. Excuse me.
I don't think an ethics board makes anything more scientific, my friend.
Can you let me? Yeah, I appreciate you trying to. I don't know if that's a fallacy that you're jumping into by jumping on that, but no. So it has like a measurable. Gosh, I'm like trying to like, because I didn't take like the way that like statistics are measured, but there is like measurability in the field of psychology. There is like things that are like it follows how a scientific paper is written when you see a psychological experiment. Like you said, the case studies aren't invalidated per se.
It does resemble science in certain mimetic ways, but like the problem is that the vast majority of the conceptual commitments of any practicing clinician are not scientific and are not supported by scientific research.
Okay, well, you could say that about some Joe Blow chemist at a community college. Like, you're
really
as long as hold up. So, like, so the mimetic practice, like, if taking mimetic to its broadest conclusions, that individual is still following to some compensable degree, although it might not always be a valid degree. It's still compensably science insofar as it's keeping to, like, say, yes, an ethics board, and yes, following the proper measurements for like statistic validity.
You're bringing up the ethics board again is baffling. It really is irrelevant.
But sure, but I'm just using that as a signpost to understand that there might be analogous things that are more valid than an ethics board. I'm not really much into how science per se is carried out, but one can at least understand that there's a certain way. Sorry?
I'll explain the difference, right? Because you talked about like some college student who was studying chemistry. Is that what you said?
Like some Joe Blow chemist at a community college.
Some Joe Blow. What does that mean? Chemist meaning like someone who's studying chemistry or someone who's teaching chemistry?
Like someone who has like some sort of undergraduate or master's degree that allows them to teach science at a community college, and they're teaching chemistry.
Okay. So the thing is so when we're talking about like the difference between like a mimetic elements of science and science itself, right? Pseudoscience has mimetic elements of science, but that's all it has. The critical thing to note when we're distinguishing pseudoscience from science is that pseudoscience is based on a body of quote unquote knowledge, which actually isn't true. And obviously, truth is a requirement for us to consider something knowledge. The chemist who's teaching chemistry at this community college, he has an understanding, he has a body of knowledge that actually is knowledge. That's why we would call him scientifically informed, maybe.
Right.
To me, it seems obvious that like psychology lacks many of the defining features of science, arguably barely resembling science at all in some ways. And yes, it has certain mimetic, because that's the thing is given that psychology is a field of like study, let's say, that we're interested in, right? It makes sense that we're going to try and scienceify it, right? To try to increase its credibility, right? But the fact that it includes certain practices that are also included in sciences does not in and of itself make it a science, right? It has to meet, like, there's a broad sort of swath of criteria that we expect science, what we call science, to meet, right? Like, for example, consider medieval medicine, right? I mean, it involved knowledge of plants and therefore knowledge of drugs. It involved some knowledge of anatomy. I mean, this knowledge was probably pretty flawed. They probably thought things that weren't true, but at least they knew that, for instance, if this is wrong and I do this, sometimes they get better, right?
Yeah, black box is there maybe, but there's some result that comes about it.
Yeah, exactly. So frequently they would do something which sort of worked, but usually not for the reason the physician thought it was working, right? The medical theories of the past were bizarre. Many of them, yeah, was certainly untrue. No question about it. You know, doctors used leeches and maggots, practiced bloodletting, and prescribed the organs of dead people. To eat the organs of dead people as medicine sometimes, right? Would we really call this science?
I mean, like, this is where I'm like wondering whether I would accept your putting forward of this term pre-science. But I think to just make my stance clear as to why it would be a science is that it's still following those same rigorous methods to court. If you were to take a Joe Blow community college professor in psychology, who for all intents and purposes, like, let's say they both get, this chemist and this psychologist both have master's degrees in those fields, in order to, and let's assume that they're, marginally decent people when it comes to how to get their work in and to practice, like say with being like a clinician for the psychologist or being a scientist with a chemist, excusing the fact that they do have different titles thereby, funny thing, that they're still being held accountable to the same criterion that would make a science in both cases, that they have to submit papers with a certain way that they're formed. I'm saying that where the science is here and why psychology would be a real science in this case, it's that it's following in tow the same way that a chemist would have to follow in tow the work that he submits to make his practice scientifically valid.
Honestly, this is ridiculous. Like, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that as long as it has the trappings of science, then that's good enough for you. Like,
no, it's not good enough for me. I'm saying that is good enough to call it science today in this culture.
Definitely not.
Currently.
Definitely not.
Well, why do we have things like the DSM-5? Why do we have things that set down, okay, this is valid science, this is what we're working with? I mean, like, these things change with chemical laws. These things change with physical laws when they find outliers.
The DSM-5 is a manual for a practical activity, namely the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. You saying that the trappings of science makes it scientific is absurd.
I didn't say trappings, by the way.
Lots of things have the trappings is like the kinds of things, sort of artifacts you might so for instance, I might be poor but buy things a rich person would own. I have the trappings of wealth. It looks like I have money, but I'm paying it off, at fucking $50 a week or what, I don't know, whatever it is.
Well, yeah, I'm not saying that that this psychologist in community college has just made up his own certificates, or has gone to these certificate programs even that give him quote unquote looking like they have more credentials. I'm saying that when they are practicing,
no. What I meant by trappings of science, what I meant by trappings of science was, for instance, publishing your ideas in the form of a paper and submitting it to a quote unquote journal. That's a trapping of science. That does not scientific practice make. Okay? And here's an example of why not, is because you can write any old ideas down on paper and send them in to someone who agrees to publish them to other people who are interested in hearing ideas. If your ideas are not falsifiable, if there's no way to experimentally evaluate them, then the idea that science is just anything that sort of looks like science or has some characteristics, which we would expect to see from science, really includes a whole bunch of stuff that we already automatically know just does not count as science, right? Flat Earth theory, for example.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
No, okay, so let me take a point.
1 sec, 5 seconds. It doesn't matter how scientific a flat earther makes it look, it is not scientific.
Yeah. No. Okay. So I'll take your point. That is a good point. So, what if this psychologist submits to a shoddy journal, or is, like you were saying, he's a flat earther or something like that, and wants to, for some arbitrary reason, let's say somehow a psychologist can talk about being a flat earther for this instance here. That would be a way to qualify it, yes, as trappings of science, excusing some possible flattery. Good job. Keep me to my rigorousness, if you will. But yes, keeping to a rigor here.
Sounds like you're kind of missing my point.
I'm sorry?
It sounds like you're kind of missing my point.
Well, no. I think I take your point that submitting to a journal doesn't necessarily make it escape from this idea of trappings of science. I got to rethink this a little bit, I think.
Okay, maybe my apologies then. Maybe I was wrong. Well, maybe another example will be helpful, right? Woodworking, right? Obviously, woodworking involves knowledge. Would you agree?
Yeah, sure. I got less than 30 minutes, but yeah, sure.
It's not science, though. We wouldn't call woodworking science. It's artifice. You're making something. You're producing something, some effect, something, yeah? Some object or effect, yeah.
Yeah, some sort of a rough and tumble experimentation, if you will.
No.
Oh, okay.
In theory, we could say maybe the application of theoretical knowledge. But the reason I choose woodworking is you really don't need to have theoretical knowledge. You can, I suppose, what you're calling rough and tumble experimentation or whatever, right? You can sort of figure it out, learn it get procedural knowledge just by trying and maybe watching other people who know how to do it or whatever, right? But the point that I'm making is, despite the fact that it obviously involves, let's say, even maybe some theoretical knowledge, we just normally wouldn't call it science. It's just not in the category of science, right?
It might be I don't know.
So you're not willing to bite that bullet. Okay, well, regardless,
at least there's just room for doubt. But I think even your woodworking example is a decent one. I'd like I said, I got to rethink my position if I were to try to say that for my positive position.
It's just an analogy anyway. My point is doctoring the soul, right? Which that's the proper purpose of psychology. And doctoring the soul is much more similar to an art than it is to a science. It involves a set of techniques which can vary based on the practitioner, but they're all focused on producing a certain result, namely mental health and overall well-being, right? But are the ideas that the practitioners hold, are they true? And if so, which ones are true? Because, and this is kind of the point, is there are lots of them, and none of them have empirical support in the way we would traditionally understand it, right? Like, there are many different models of what causes illness in people, you know, more generally, and what the correct approach in terms of talk therapy or whatever is, like, appropriate, and that's based on some theoretical construct about how the mind works, which is not empirically verified, right? And I don't know if you know this, but there are actually studies which show that the theoretical framework that the clinician takes into talk therapy doesn't really matter. It turns out to be quite statistically insignificant when it comes to determining whether the patient will recover. But what actually did show a statistically significant result is the quality of the relationship that exists between the patient and the therapist. That's what statistically correlates with their probability of recovering, right? And again, as I sort of said earlier, there is no formula for caring for someone. There's no such thing as a science of being a good person.
I think that there could be, but this is where I'm like, okay, I still really haven't established what is pre-scientific or not. That was a good intro, by the way, considering that today's psychology is pre-science. But you know, I doubt that.
You doubt what exactly?
I doubt that there could be a science of a good person. Even right now, there
I
might be.
I didn't say there couldn't be. I didn't say there couldn't be. I said there isn't. There isn't one.
Currently, there isn't.
There is no such thing. We don't have such a science.
No. I think that when we're giving accurate labels to things, like I think more or less we've however negative or positive connotation to it, that we've given an accurate sort of array of traits that one could identify with someone having psychopathy or not. Even in the fields of neuropsychology.
Dude, I'm not saying that there's nothing descriptively accurate about psychology's like attempts to account for, let's say, illnesses or whatever. What I'm trying to explain is, like, that as well, the illness description, that part, the diagnostic manual and all that, that is arguably kind of scientific, okay? What I'm trying to explain is psychology isn't about the diagnosis. That's just the first step. Psychology is about making you better. You are mentally unwell. A psychologist helps you get better, okay? And what I'm trying to explain is that the ideas the psychologist is employing in order to make you better, it kind of seems like it doesn't even matter if they're true.
Oh, let's see here. Where are we at? Timekeep, could I get time? Check the chat. I think Jack's typing. Timekeep, could I get time? Ah, perfect. 40 minutes are up.
Well, no, we're 40 minutes in. So that means there's 10.
Yeah, you said 5. Oh, we do 5:55?
No.
I thought it was 5:45.
40 minutes in counts the initial 10 minutes we each had. Do you understand? So we get to 50 minutes. Oh my God, this is such a waste of time. We get to 50 minutes and then we have 5 minutes each. Do you understand me?
Okay, 5:55. Thank you. So, but then, if you take the psychology in a broader sense of its historical, happenstances, like you're bringing up alchemy, for example, like if we were to look at, like, say, pre-psychology, if you will, I think if you were to look at psychology zoomed out, that's not to abandon, like, say, like post-Freudian psychology as it's currently standing. We were talking about the DSM-5 just now, for example. And talking about how, for the most part, it's a clinical practice as it stands today, as a science. At least that's the end result when we're talking about a career psychologist. But if you were to look at psychology on the whole, I think that you would actually see that it's a science as it is. If we were to take even science to a broader, to avoid this sort of idea of a mimetic trapping, I think if you look at science in even a larger definition.
Yeah, but that's the thing is, it doesn't have anything that's falsifiable, though. Like, when it comes to the descriptions of the psyche that are used in... This is what I'm trying to explain is the practice of psychology, like the ideas are all good and well, okay? The practice of psychology is trying to help someone get better, okay? And so what I'm trying to explain is the ideas the therapist, aka the practitioner, takes into therapy, they are not empirically validated. How can you call that a science? What is scientific about that?
I was wondering if I had a problem with this as throughout the conversation, but I don't think that like in a sense the therapist at that point is a scientist. It's like saying that a person that I meet at the pharmacy is a scientist.
Yes. Okay. Obviously, the therapist is not a scientist. We would call the psychological researcher perhaps a scientist. But regardless, what I'm trying to explain is, and I did mention this in my opening statement, is that psychological research has done little to nothing to confirm the central concepts of the main schools of thought that guide clinical practice. So there's no empirical support for the theories we use to try to help people get better, by and large. There are like 1 or 2 types of therapy that show essentially a statistically significant sort of improvement, but usually it's in relation to specific conditions that the theoretical, let's say, apparatus is suited to, right? And in relation to other conditions, there seems to be very little effect or none. And again, what we might be seeing there is that it's just the case that the quality of the relationship overrides that sort of factor of what methodology you're using, right? But like at the end of the day, what I'm trying to explain is that like when it comes to psychological practice, the concepts which are being employed by the practitioners do not have empirical support. That is the reality of it. And I don't see how you can call it scientific if, let's say, like these central concepts either are not falsifiable or any attempts that we've made to falsify them have come up inconclusive. I just don't see it. I can't see where you're getting off calling it scientific.
Well, this is where I started to zoom out into like the larger parts of history of psychology, because so far the debate has taken the vector of which we were defining psychology and science as its current clinical practice as it is today. Like I said, from 19...
I'm also willing to talk about historical psychology. Historical psychology is even better for me because historical psychology is full of things that I mentioned, like the MBTI and other typologies, which really, it's like all this work has gone into defining this conceptual system. And then when we do tests, it's like there's nothing there.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying. Like, we're talking about science and psychology in the modern sense. Is that correct?
I'm also willing to include its history because that makes my case even stronger.
How far back?
As far as it goes.
Well, yeah, are we talking about like the Greeks?
If you like. I don't think we could be talking about psychology at that point. It has to be, I would think, a differentiated field of study. But if you want to spend the last 5 minutes of the dialogue talking about what the Greeks thought, I'd be happy. I love the Greek sort of blending of psychology and philosophy and everything. But that's not what science means. The Greeks didn't have a word for science. They had natural philosophy. Science is what we call it when we split up the world into different areas where we can explore the phenomena independently of the other confounding variables.
Right. No. Okay. So this is where I was wondering, like, even where science was and how broadly we're going. Because if we're taking psychology insofar as if we're taking what science is or isn't, then I feel a little stumped.
You feel stumped? What do you mean?
No, I feel like I feel defeated. I feel like I can't defend this position anymore.
So what, are you conceding? What's going on?
Maybe it's just okay. So that's what I'm trying to establish. Though, is that insofar as we're defining psychology or not, we're ascertaining what science is or not, and that's why I was talking about like this sort of more broader like marker of like, okay, are we talking about are we talking about the modern era or not?
Well, here's what I would ask you: is how would you define science?
Well, how personally?
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to tell you very easily personally with the time we have left to, affirm my position.
Well, like at least give me some characteristics that you think are like fundamentally associated with scientific practice.
there's some sort of level of knowledge gathering that has to occur for science to get established. Sure, there's something.
Okay, that's one criteria. What else?
There's some sort of a level of, as you know, I was fond of saying, a level of rigor that needs to be happening. It's not just blatant knowledge gathering. There needs to be some sort of level of criterion within that knowledge gathering, what you're looking for, what you're not looking for.
What else?
Oh goodness, sorry, I got
Is that all?
But sorry, I got distracted by text as it's kind of died down. I'm like, okay, I should actually look at this stuff.
You have ADHD.
Yeah, shush. Goodness gracious. No, so like another criterion, like say if I wanted to like personally define science as it is, because this is what I'm thinking, is that it needs to be broader than just sort of this sort of modern instantiation of what we do with science. Like if we were to say like that, because you were talking about like what was that you were saying earlier? The science of what is a good human. So you were saying like some sort of like that psychology isn't right now. You were saying something like that. What was that? I could help with that definition of science, but I need to recall that point.
It wasn't a definition of science. I'm saying we don't have a science of being a good person.
Okay, that's what I was trying to remember. Thank you. We've had that as far as we could even say that psychology could be defined as that in a much broader sense across history before even the modern instantiation of how science is instantiated today.
Okay, well, we've got 3 minutes left. I want you to use the time listing all the characteristics of science you can think of.
I do, but let's just I'm just going to make this broad claim here to be able to perhaps keep my positive position that psychology is a real science insofar it has been around for trying to make a good person way before any sort of more strict criterion that we've been sticking to with defining science in the modern day. That if we were to take science with a broader definition, psychology could therefore still remain a science if we were to think that psychology can't be verified as a science based on the more strict definition. Which
why would we take up a broader definition when it would do violence to our ability to discriminate between like scientific and pseudoscientific or unscientific ideas?
The only thing I could think of is to keep this sort of inquiry going because it's not founded as of yet or not beyond the time limit of our debate. I don't have much. I don't want to concede, but I'm feeling a little bit defeated.
Well, I'm happy to just give my closing statement now if you want then.
Yeah, please. We only got a minute left.
I'm going to start Tell me when.
Yeah, just go now here. Right. So, I mean, you talked. I got you. It was good. I got you to talk a bit about science. I think, as far as I can tell, you left out very important elements that a layperson would think of which normally characterize science, and I would say that probably the fundamental problem with your entire argument is that you never really made these connections, because these are the connections people are looking for in terms of, like, let's say, agreeing that psychology should be considered a science, right? So, like, falsifiability, right? The falsifiability of the central concepts postulated by the theories that the practitioners take into clinical practice. There's nothing, they're not falsified. Well, if they are falsifiable, they have there's any attempts to investigate whether or not they really work or whether they're there has basically come out inconclusive or is sort of disconfirmed. Been evidence against the hypothesis, I suppose, right? And a lot of them it's very difficult to see because, like, for instance, concepts of the shadow or something like that, like in terms of a scientific experiment or a scientific like laboratory sort of sterile environment where you're excluding all the other factors. I mean, it just seems impossible that you could have a non-ambiguous verification of something like the shadow. And as I said, these concepts are the ones that the practitioners are taking into their practice of psychology. So I just don't see how you can call it scientific on that basis. But also, it doesn't make any predictions. Like, it makes literally no predictions about the world. I can't see how you don't think that's worth addressing somehow, because, like, to me, like one thing science is like defined by is predicting what's going to fucking happen. And psychology doesn't do that. If and when it does this, it does it very poorly. And I would argue it really doesn't even dabble in this because it's so fucking impossible to tell what other people are going to do. It's just not, it doesn't work like that. Yeah, so there's falsifiability. There's a thing about predictions. Oh, there's one more. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, overall, I really feel like, as far as like arguing in favor of the proposition, that psychology is a real science, you've left out maybe the most important pieces, and I don't see how. If I were you, I would agree with me. Let's just say that. Time.
Are you done already?
Yep.
I was gonna say you still have like 2 full minutes. But,
I don't have anything to say, so we can do Phil's closing statement, and then I guess we'll do questions if there are any.
All right, Phil, you want to start now?
As the realest nigga of them all said earlier in the text chat, I felt that I was going to be obliterated from the start. I think I held my own a little bit. With regard to science and psychology as definitions, I think there was other mention in the text chat as well from some sort of jack of all or perhaps no trades, that it was going to be difficult to try to keep down definitions a little bit. To think that a definition such as science and psychology have, for better or for worse, perhaps in my position, perhaps out of my favor, have not really had down pat solid definitions. But this is why towards the end of my debate, I decided to move to a more broad look at what psychology or science could be defined as. Due to time restrictions, I did not have time to be able to perhaps expand on this argument. But perhaps at that, like the realist nigga said, I don't think that I'm really cut out for this kind of debating thing. Not to make any some sort of detrimental claim to my own ability, but to just simply say that I don't think that we could go so far to say that psychology may be a real science if we were to keep, as I was leading out, to consider science as is considered in our modern era, something that has rigorous testing measurements, such as this mention of falsifiability towards the end here. No, I don't want to say that psychology isn't a science, but I do. I don't think I have much that I could defend based on what we discussed so far to keep my positive position. And also, I was kind of thinking that even ending earlier with this 10-minute prior at only 40 minutes, I was thinking that we did start a little late. So it is about 7 p.m. But this has been fun, and I hope that everyone has felt that this was a nice and lively discussion. Thank you, NSYNC.
I really am a little baffled by the fact that you're basically conceding, because, like, from my perspective, your view is the correct one. I don't understand how you can concede.
Like I said, I don't think that I'm well prepared as far as a debater is concerned. I think there was some chat being made for an inquiry method of debating. I don't think I have all the requisite pieces to defend psychology as such. It's something that I've put personally to the back burner as far as like interest in any sort of psychological research. So I was kind of ill prepared doing this. And mind you, also I was kind of jumping in to defend Flappy. For that matter, we all have our personal lives, but no, yeah.
Well, but we're equally unprepared. I've never argued this position before because I don't believe it's true. And that's the thing is, to me, I just would, even though I'm like, okay, you've defeated all the arguments I prepared earlier, or like, to me, I'm like, surely you're going to come up with something else though, because the position you're defending is actually correct. So there's got to be other things to say.
No, but that's exactly what I'm saying, is that we're limited to time.
I'm not the best debater, and given that this is it's a debate competition, it's not a competition as to which view is right. To which I would tell the audience and tell anybody that's listening in that we should really consider if there's a possibility for science to be had on what a good human is and isn't. And for that matter, what a human is or is not, for that matter, what levels of scales. I'm sorry. Huh? Sorry. I'm sorry.
That was a throwaway remark. That's not. That's not
I'm sorry.
even. That was a throwaway remark, motherfucker.
The science of the good human thing.
Yes.
Okay. Well, okay. Then I stand by my previous remarks that I made about perhaps even being a baffling thing that I'm supposedly conceding, at least in small part. I'm just not a good debater, and we had limited time. And I am of the position that psychology is a real science, and that's what I did towards the end of the debate, said, okay, well, given our short amount of time, I think that if we looked at the broader history of things, even though you did well to debate against this position, I think that you presented some good points to the negative as to why perhaps psychology in a broader look at the history wouldn't be considered as science. And I think that I'm ill prepared to defend that thing insofar as my debate skill goes.
Well, you got the humility routine down pat. But so do we have any audience questions then?
And before we get audience questions, do these audience questions affect the judgment?
No, I don't think so.
All right, thank you very much.
Because I think we're out of time. Right? We ran out the clock, right? I'm thinking.
Nameless, do you want to just answer them before I ask my question, or?
I have a question.
Maybe we didn't. No, maybe we have.
We'd have like 2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, people can ask me questions if you don't want to. If you don't want the things you say to affect you.
Cool. So I guess in sync. I don't know how okay this is. I'm not going to debate, but there's perhaps a series of questions, like conditional questions.
Okay.
So if we exclude therapy in and of itself and just look at modern psychology, I'm assuming based on the, I guess, first half question, I'm assuming based on the debate up to this point, you're including things like, what's it called, neuropsych, and like or psych research as part of like quote unquote psychology, right?
Yep.
So if we exclude therapy and we sort of look at these more modern types of psychology, would you maintain, I guess, as strict a claim as that these things are pseudoscientific or pre-scientific?
Oh, I would never say pseudoscientific because I don't believe that.
Pre-scientific, then I think, as you said. Sorry.
So sorry, what was the question? Can you repeat it for me?
If we exclude sort of therapy and application, right? Because the assumption is that therapists are sort of doing the best they can with the tools they have, right? If we exclude sort of this applied like therapeutic thing, and we just focus more on like these modern versions of like research psych and neuropsych and stuff, would you, I guess, as strictly hold your proposition that those things are pre-scientific?
I'd probably weaken it a lot, to be honest. But I would hold something like that, but in a much weaker form. Therapy, I think, the fact that therapy is what I see as the main practice of psychology, that I think really buttressed the argument that I was making. Without that, it doesn't amount to much, I think.
Okay. And then just, I guess, a follow-up question. In that regard, would you consider applied medicine, like the act of, I guess, doing medicine on people, a science or no?
Close to a science, but with elements of an art.
Okay.
I think medicine specifically is much closer to science than psychology. But they're both on the spectrum between the two, basically, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Anybody else? We've now run out the clock, so Phil can answer questions if you have any.
don't see much. Wait, there's one hand, or at least I see Jack's hand up.
Yeah, Jack might have something to say to you, Phil. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I guess figured if I didn't want to eat up unnecessary time, but so I guess a follow-up question, right? Or a messier one, right? We can agree that I think we can all agree based on the conversation prior that like the brain is very messy, and sort of the therapeutic aspect and research aspect of this is very messy. And there's a lot of like I don't want to say intersectional because it's not the right word, but I think it gets the meaning across. Intersectional factors or comorbidities in the context of psych. And I'm wondering if there's some degree to which I guess in sync, this is a question more so, and I'm trying to phrase it as such. The reliability problem you bring up in terms of the ability for therapeutic methods to be successful, or the descriptions of certain, I guess, more scientific aspects of this to be successful. I'm just wondering if this is going to be one of those, or I'm just wondering how you would compare that to something like more chaotic aspects of science, right? Like chemistry or quantum mechanics or taxonomy type stuff.
From my perspective, I like if you. So you're asking. That's the thing is, are you asking what I would say from the position of the debater, the debate I was just having, or are you asking my genuine point of view?
From the position of the debate you're having, right, where we've got these really messy, pseudo-reliable sciences that make like probabilistic predictions. Yeah.
Well, what I would say is that on a probabilistic basis, at present, there is only one or two types of therapy that have like significant results, basically. So, like one example is exposure therapy. That's really good at treating certain kinds of anxiety disorders and phobias. And another one is CBT. I think is quite effective. Probably because it promotes sort of being self-aware in a way, which is obviously going to help you figure your own problems out, which is less of a theoretical commitment to any kind of like psychological constructs, right? Yeah, it's more an idea of reframing how you're thinking about yourself.
I guess the last question then, to sort of make a comparison to a science, right, is it seems like a lot of the psychology-related research has to take place over extended periods of time, right? We're talking about successes over years of periods of life. And so it seems like often we get things wrong, but it seems like there's another type of science that also has to deal with incredible timescales that also seems to get things wrong. And we have to constantly reassess our understanding of it, which is like astrophysics. Right?
Yes, but what I would say is the difference is that, like, in this case, there's no real getting things wrong because there aren't any predictions. Like, it's more like it's effective or it isn't effective for producing the result, which is why I liken it more to an art. It either works or it doesn't. Whether or not the entities exist is sort of out of the question. It doesn't matter. The question is, does it promote mental well-being in the patient?
That would be your predictability, though, right?
Well, no. Well, but this is what I'm saying is that when it comes to that, as to whether certain theories, like reliably, are able to produce wellness, the answer is no. That the quality of the relationship significantly overshadows any kind of correlation attached to the specific theory.
Right. I don't disagree with that. Right. I guess my question is like, is it possible that like the scientific method is being undergone, but it just so happens to be the case that like the periods of time required to collect the data are so long that we just haven't reached them yet?
If what you're saying is you would call it like a proto-science rather than pre-science, I might be amenable to that description, but that's still not science.
Not even that. The methodology would remain the same. The claim would be that you just don't have a large enough data set, right?
Yes, but until you have some degree of falsifiability, which comes with having the data set, I can't see how you can justify calling it science. Because you're just guessing until then.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay. I understand what you're still debating from the opposing point, so I get what you're trying to do, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah. What's up, Brandon?
What's up? So I'm wondering if you think that psychology is only not a science because humans are too complicated or complex to be easily predict the outcomes because it's like so many multi-factor, stack up issues. So I'm asking if you think it's potentially a science and we just don't have a great understanding of it.
Yes, I think it's potentially a science, but I don't think it's just that it's complex, although I do think that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
But I also think that apart from it being complex, the ideas we currently have are helpful for helping us to make sense of what's going on, but probably not really true, I suppose.
So helpful, but not true. Does that indicate that humans?
No. Helpful for helping us to make sense of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That's not necessarily helpful, for instance, for fixing anything, that's kind of what I was saying, is that
It's a precursor to that.
Not necessarily, because you can make sense of something in a way that doesn't match the way things actually are.
True. So I was gonna go there. Is it preferable to have a positive outcome in therapy, to have a positive outcome that's not rooted in a epistemological foundation versus not having the same gains but coming from I guess a rooted position?
That's a good question. Did you say is it preferable?
Yes.
Yes, it probably is preferable.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing that I've come across a few times.
What's more preferable is both.
Sure, of course, it's ideal.
Well, no, that is the baseline for the ideal, maybe. Like, the ideal is much better than that. The ideal is something we're actually pretty confident is really true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I would add that.
the testability thing is like, you want that as a minimum, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah. Was that the only question, or because we're probably, if there's not other questions, we can probably just end it soon. Surely in the next 5 minutes or something.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't have anything right now, but I'm really interested in this conversation. I'd be interested in keeping it going.
I'm pretty happy with my performance, to be honest. Because I don't really. It's interesting. Been an interesting exploration, actually, Jack. I will get back to you on that argument we had about practicing.
Let's go.
I'm going to think a bit more about that, because that was it. This was an interesting experience. Because I think it's stupid to do that, I've never really tried. And in situations where I have had to, it's been about things I don't care about, which makes it, in a sense, easier because you're not attached. Whereas on this topic, I'm firmly on the side of the affirmative. I think psychology absolutely is a science. So it's really interesting to have to try to argue that it wasn't.
No, I'm saying it's a really useful internal test, right, for your own ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the true question is your mom a real science?
There is a real science that deals with seducing my mother, yes.
Oh, okay.
Oops. So are we done? Anyone else? No one else?
That was interesting.
Was I the only one that heard NSYNC? I mean, I could guess, but I was just wondering what are we doing right now?
Doing your mom.
No, she is currently helping me clean things up. Again, you're not there. Yes, it is Matthew. He's busy trying to debate me about how psychology is not a science.
What do you mean trying to debate you? What do you mean trying to debate you? I slammed you, my nigga.
Bro, cool the jets. You need to work on the humility department.
Dude, I'm humble enough, but I know what happened.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, I stated what I said. I know what happened.
You conceded, for fuck's sake. Come on.
Dude, I even referenced the realist. I even referenced Raj. Of course I got obliterated.
What do you mean you referenced Raj? What
I
is that
said,
supposed to be?
in my closing statement, I said, as the realest nigga of them all said. That's his name. Chill out, mother.
I love it.
Yeah, he says that. Raj says at the beginning, he's just like, what he says. He says, Phil is going to get obliterated. He didn't even spell it right, I think.
Does your mother know about NSYNC and his efforts to get with her?
She does.
Is that what I heard before?
Yeah, Omi. I told James. I told her yesterday.
She engaged in it, James.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
What'd you do?
She said that it had been a long time.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
in, mate. You're in.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, he actually spelled it right. Yeah, he said, oh, that's what he said. Poor Phil bought instead of about to. He said, bought get obliterated to your face. That's what he said. Shit. No, are we, are we finito?
Yeah, is it the final judgment, I guess? I know there's probably a better word for that. Is that NSYNC won 3-0 vote, I believe.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 3-0.
Sure.
In favor of NSYNC, of course.
We deal. Do we is there anything else like Avi, we can go to like pensive or conceptual for like further chat, but like is there anything else that we got to be here for, not to run away?
No, I think we're done.
Okay, bet. Glad I could step in. Sorry I wasn't
thanks for filling in.
Yeah.
About half, by the way, about half of the psychological community are against Myers-Briggs. The other half are still considering it. And so to say that it's outright disputed by like the entire sociological community is just bullshit.
That's not what I said, though, because your original claim was that these personalities are genetically inherited.
5 to 10 words. That wow. I guess I didn't know how to count.
As I said, right. Hypothesis testing is definitely an element of science, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens prior and post, right? We have a lot of we conduct a whole bunch of experiments for which we have no hypothesis that we're doing, and it's still valid science. So we know that there's a whole bunch of scientific activity we recognize as being part of the conduct of a science.
I've been honest whenever I've asked a question.
Oh, fuck me. You can be
don't
honest.
think I have,
Dude,
but
shut
I
the
honestly
fuck
have been.
up. Shut up. You can be honest, right, in actually wanting an answer and still use the question dishonestly in a public setting. Are you fucking familiar with that idea? You can have an honest curiosity.
I've never done philosophy, so
it's not philosophy.
I might be wrong.
It's not philosophy. It's not philosophy. What we're talking about is we're talking about psychology, right? We're talking about the fact